Welcome everybody to Getting APIs to Work. Today we say hello to Liam Forde. Hey Liam, how are you doing?
Good, Eric. Thanks. Nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining. Liam is founder and head of product at Webhookie. And Webhookie, as you can probably easily tell, works with webhooks. And that is what we will talk about today. So what are webhooks? Why are they useful? How do they work? And why may they be something interesting to look at? Liam, just to get started, if you had to describe webhooks to somebody in just 2 or 3 sentences, how would you describe what webhooks are and why they may be interesting for somebody?
Well, webhooks are a reverse API. So when an event happens in a system, it will push data to its consumer, where in contrast to a REST API, where it's request driven, you are pulling data from a system and asking it. So it's event driven. A webhook is event driven data.
Yes, so that's the special thing. I think that makes a lot of sense to really put the focus on that. It is about events, and this is a good starting point to dive a little bit deeper. In my mind, the way I talk about APIs, there are 5 different styles of APIs. So there are the good old RPC, then there are resource oriented, then there are the hypermedia APIs, then there are the query based APIs, and all of these are synchronous. So you send a request, you get a response. And then the fifth kind, that's the kind that you were just talking about, is really different from the other 4 because it works the other way around. You called them reverse APIs, which also is an interesting term, I think, there, because it is important that they do the usual control flow in a different way. Now, you might think, okay, how does that work, or why do I need it? Why is it interesting and relevant nowadays to have this kind of control flow? And I think it's really interesting to look at it a little bit closer because we see more and more organizations starting to be interested or embrace that particular style. So I think we do see some interest, and it's interesting to think about why that might be.
Well, I think what we're seeing is, I mean, off the back of the success of APIs in general, which has really transformed how enterprises work, making them a lot more agile, making integration get done faster. And what we've seen is, with REST APIs, they're creating data in backend systems. But what happens is there's a whole ecosystem of other systems and services around here. And this is coming off the back of the microservice architecture, but also just in general, distributed systems. And with now companies have seen the success of APIs, they want to use them everywhere. And instead of having all these extra services and systems all around, event-driven APIs can push that data to those systems, bringing that data to them in real time. And that's where I think you're seeing this surge come in again with event-driven architecture, is that companies want that benefit of APIs and they want it further into their back-end integrations.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I also liked a lot that you mentioned microservices. Just recently, I had Ronnie Mitra talking about microservices. And one of his points was that he said, if you're doing microservices, you will end up with event-driven APIs eventually, because for quite a number of the services that you implement, things happen in that service, and you want to notify others of these things having happened without them having to poll. So I think that's kind of really a natural development there, and I really like kind of this perspective of saying more and more things are getting API-ified, so to speak. And with that increased API-ification, we probably also need like a little bit bigger tool set of how we do APIs. And we definitely see that. So a lot of requests for what do we do with event-driven APIs, how we do them, and so forth. Now, one of the things that people almost automatically always go to when it comes to events is to say, Kafka, we'll do Kafka. And that seems to be like the default that's always mentioned. And sometimes it's like, okay, that is a piece of software you can use, but it's not like everything. So how would you compare like this Kafka thing that's coming up so much with this idea of event-driven API? I think that's something that's really interesting to dissect a little bit, because I think there's an interesting overlap there, but also an interesting difference in what these things really are and what they can do for you.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, Kafka is one of the biggest tools in the event-driven architecture space, and where Kafka really is positioned is in this microservice architecture. To connect all these different services that are going around and providing the events, and that's perfect. But there's a wider space of event-driven APIs out there, and one of the key positions that webhooks, for example, play is, well, what happens when you want to start sharing those events with systems outside of the Kafka network, out of your network? And that's where HTTP has always been one of the go-to protocols for sharing data across networks, and it makes it easier. So using like webhooks, for example, is a great solution to connect other systems outside of your network and push that data to them.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. The way you're saying is that Kafka, to me, it's the same thing, right? It's more system architecture. It's how you build a relatively well, let's say, contained system. It's still big, but it's like a system that you're building. And then the question is, but now what do you do if you want to communicate with the outside of that? And that's exactly where, like you say, HTTP is very popular. It's something that people want to do. And if you look at how event-driven APIs that are supposed to be public, let's say, or at least to external to your company, how these are getting implemented, HTTP definitely is a good choice, and webhooks are a good choice there as well. Now, before we jump a little bit into what webhooks can do for you there, just one question, because I'm curious as well how you see that space. Now, are there any big competitors to webhooks in that space? Or would you say that if what you want to do is build kind of externally facing APIs that are event oriented, then some shape or form of webhooks probably will be a good fit for you? Is there an alternative that you see a lot?
Well, I see a lot of companies building their own sort of webhook infrastructure using event-driven type tooling. So using Kafka's or using any sort of enterprise bus type technologies out there. So that's what I see a lot. I see a lot of companies going for that. But now, as we want to API-fy more, using your wording there, I think this is, you need a little bit more sophistication than what companies have typically provided in this space.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's always a question of asking yourself as an organization also, are we in the business of building API technology, or isn't that something where we maybe would prefer to use some existing infrastructure that's around? But apart from like building your own version of webhooks, is there anything else that you see that's being popular, or are webhooks kind of the go-to solution that people are using in some shape or form?
Well, I think for event-driven architecture, there's a lot of different use cases out there, and there's, as you sort of hinted at before, there's a lot of different solutions out there. So, I mean, you've got WebSockets, you've got server-sent events, you've got lots of different types of event-driven APIs there, and I think they all have their specific place and fit for the use cases they serve. So. Yeah, lots of different patterns out there, but it's about picking the right pattern for the right use case.
Yeah, WebSockets and server-sent events actually are pretty interesting as well. But yeah, we won't discuss them today. But you're right. There's more out there that you could possibly use as your foundation. But let's jump in and talk a little bit about webhooks. So webhooks are, I would say, you could say they're a pattern. Would you agree that it's a pattern, or how would you characterize webhooks?
Definitely a pattern. Yeah.
Okay. And the pattern is HTTP based, as you said. And now let's walk through very briefly how that pattern, like what does that pattern look like? If you had to kind of dissect it into the different steps that happen, what would be those steps?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing with the pattern is you need to be able to set up a subscription to a topic, if you like. So that is the first part, and you see other patterns on top of that, such as REST hooks, are coming to actually describe a little bit more how that can be done through REST APIs. But you can basically set up a subscription. Then what that subscription generally contains is a URL endpoint where I want that data to be sent, and maybe some security information around that. And then when those events occur at the API provider, they're then pushed to those subscriptions to their callback URLs.
So that's, at a very high level, sounds like a relatively simple thing to do. I subscribe to something, and then if that something happens at the source, I'll get a notification that tells me, okay, this, like, the thing that you're interested in actually happened. What are some of the complications, or what are the, like, okay, this is the happy path, right, as you typically talk about it? Like, what are the not so happy things that can also happen that you also need to deal with if you really want to implement that pattern in a robust and scalable way?
Yeah, and this is the challenge with webhooks, and where you have to bring, because it's never the happy path that's the problem. And that you're right. I mean, because whenever you're pushing data to clients, those clients may not be available at the time, and therefore you need to have your retry strategies to make sure that that system gets your data. Otherwise, you drop webhooks and people don't trust your solution or have any rely on it at all. So the error handling is very important with a webhook solution. And of course, if you know your HTTP response codes, as we like to do in our API world, you know that some responses mean don't try again. Other responses mean do try. I'm just down right now. So handling those is one of the most important things with a webhook solution. You also want to provide some capability for companies to maybe go in and inspect what's been sent to them, having an audit trail of what's coming through to your input, just to gain trust in your solution. Replay messages is also a very common requirement now we're seeing, where you want to actually, even though the data is flowing through, maybe for whatever reason, they need to replay those messages coming back. Those sort of requirements. And then you've got the security requirements on top, which are just getting more and more complicated, in terms of, to make sure that, you're either using HMAC, symmetric encryption, or you're using OAuth, sort of the client credentials flow, or you adding different other layers of security on top, such as mutual TLS. So there's lots of challenges to a webhook solution.
Off the top of my head, let me think. Maybe there's one more thing. So I think another interesting thing to look at, and I'm wondering how you see that, is kind of expiring of subscriptions, right? It's like, are subscriptions something that you have to keep forever? Do you have to refresh them? What's your view on that?
Again, I think it comes down to the use case. I think when you look at maybe the content distribution type subscriptions that where webhooks have played a role in the past with standards like WebSub. There, if you've got a subscription to maybe if it's a publication, it makes sense that expires, because maybe in 6 months' time you're no longer interested in that publication, or in you want to renew it. If you're talking about B2B type flows, where we're getting a flow of data going between two companies, often that's not going to be expiration based. You want that to happen until you say stop. And that rarely happens. So it comes down to the use case.
Okay, but that's I think that's another interesting thing, right? Where you could say, well, the pattern is interesting, but then you have another kind of design parameter that you could tweak and say, okay, we have expiring subscriptions, or we don't. And like you said, right, it can depend very much on the environment you're in, the subscribers you have, and how you want to deal with that. Coming from this background of, the more content-based, like the good old days of webhooks, so to speak, I also remember something being rather important, which was this difference between fat and thin notifications. Do I send everything in the callback request that is being sent, or is that basically really just a ping, and then the receiver of the callback gets the opportunity to get everything, but they have to send another request for getting that? Like, how do you see those design options being treated, or do you have any opinions on this kind of variation of the pattern?
Yeah, and I think that those patterns come from the security background of it. So, generally it was easier just to ping a client with a webhook, generally because the webhook was seen as a less secure option, and it was more difficult to implement the authorization checks, and then allow the client to then do a REST API call, and that would then check the authority to say yes, you had the authority.
Okay, that would go through the whole authentication chain.
Yeah, and
that makes sense.
But I think now what you see is more sophisticated webhook solutions that can, and with the rise of event-driven architecture, taking care of that sort of security, and you see more fat type requests going through, because in the end of the day, you don't want to have that extra step of having to make another call to get the data.
Well, that depends what the data is, right? So I remember those times, when you were subscribing to, let's say, a podcast and a new video episode becomes available. Well, you don't want those 2 gigabytes to be sent to you in the callback, no. Right? So, but again, maybe that's a little bit of an extreme example, but I think, there again, right, depending on what you do and what you expect those messages to carry as their payload, you might go one way or the other. So what we see, and I think this is kind of it's a good way for us to wrap this one up here. So what we see is it's a simple pattern, but just now, right, we went through a couple of, well, you can do this differently, this differently, this differently. So there are a couple of variations. There are a couple of things you have to keep in mind when things are not going according to the happy path. And I think just going back to what you said, what you're seeing, that organizations are kind of implementing their own webhook thing, right? Their own infrastructure. How well is that working? I'm really wondering. And of course, in like full transparency here, right? So you're working on a solution that organizations then can use, and I think that really is a very good idea. But just from your experience, because I'm sure you have seen organizations doing it themselves, how well, like, were there times when you said, oh, that's good enough, just keep using that? Or were there many times when you said, that's really not so great? It's like, what's your experience from looking at what organizations have been doing so far?
Well, I think up until today, what organizations have been doing is good enough. But now with the rise of event-driven architecture and this whole API-driven movement, we want to do more. Like, the good enough is not good enough anymore. And therefore, you want to provide sophisticated solutions which can do, more. You want to add more features. You want to make your APIs discoverable, for one. You want to, maybe start adding filtering to your webhooks so you can let your consumers filter what they want. You might want to start adding transformation to your webhooks so that consumers can start transforming data that they subscribe to before it hits their infrastructure. So, and again, with the security options, you want to support more and more consumers out there, and each consumer has their own security requirements. So some will want OAuth, some will want API keys, some will want HMAC signatures. So if you've done something yourself, you've got to keep extending it. And we all know homegrown stuff has a lifespan. You can only go so far with it. Normally the initial requirements, it's good, it meets that, but then you want to start extending it, and then it starts breaking, or it starts, and so that's where, some off-the-shelf type software that can give that level of sophistication, give that roadmap, is is desirable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And just going back to where we started, right? One thing that we see is that event-driven APIs are becoming more and more popular. More and more organizations are embracing them for good reasons. I think we discussed some of the use cases of event-driven APIs in general. So that, in my mind, also means that, as you pointed out, right, the scenarios that you might want to support, the consumers that you might see, the needs that they might have, this is probably going to become a little bit more complex, a little bit more diverse. So I think when we look at webhooks, what we can end up with is saying it's an interesting pattern, but like all patterns, it also has a couple of things to think through. And so before you really jump at it and say we're doing that, it's also, I think, an interesting exercise to think a little bit more about, well, what do we want to do with it and how future proof is that going to be? Liam, thank you so much for joining. I think we ended up with, in my mind, a really nice tour of what webhooks are and a little bit of how they work. Not very technical, but at least I think it was a good discussion of what they do in general and what interesting design considerations are. Are there any things you would like to add? Any observations you've recently had that would be relevant for our discussion here?
No, I think this is a really good start and a really good intro. And really, thanks for the opportunity, Eric. It was great to be speaking with you.
Thanks for joining, Liam. I hope everybody you liked it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you like API content in general, please consider subscribing. And with that, we are done for today. Thanks everybody for watching and see you soon. Bye.